Let me talk about the RPT agent. By way of review, the agent injects load and executes the scripts. The workbench controls the agents, and the agent should be on a private network with the server that's under test. You don't need agents to test out RPT. You can run the workbench with 5 local users without getting a license and without installing agents. But best practice says don't run the agent on the same system as the workbench if you're trying to get performance metrics, because the workbench can start interfering with the agents. I'm going to talk about setting up the agent. That's an IBM Installation Manager install. You specify during that install where the workbench is, the workbench name, and the port it's on. You can specify that after install if you don't get it during install. And you probably need to disable firewalls because the agent talks to the workbench on port 7080 or 7443 by default. You can change those defaults in the workbench by going to Preferences, Test Server. And there's a discussion at the URL that discusses ports, because you might need to know that to disable firewalls. Part of the setup of the agent is that you specify the location where the agent stores data, and you specify that at the workbench, but you do need to create that directory first. And you can specify additional JVM params for the agent at the workbench in the RPT VM args parameter. I'll show you where to find that, but in general you don't really have to set up any additional. And you can monitor the agents from a workbench to see if they're online, and you can share them from the workbench with a different workbench, but only one workbench at a time can use the agents. In other words, you can't have agents running 2 tests at the same time for 2 different workbenches. And if you're going to compare 2 different performance runs, you should have the same number of agents, preferably even the same agents, because the agent processing does affect response time. So if you have 2 agents in one run and 5 agents in another run, and you're running the same number of V users, the runs with 5 agents will have less to do at the agents, and so they'll probably report a faster response time. I'm not going to take you through the entire install, but I'll just point out some of the important things. It's an Installation Manager install, and you pick the Performance Tester agent. And during the course of setting up, it's going to ask you where your workbench is, and you specify it on the screen. And as I said, it's not that important. If you don't know the answer here, you can always edit the file where this information gets stored. And that file is on the workbench, and it's in a file called majordomo config. And you can edit this at any time and add more workbenches by simply duplicating the workbenches stanza there, or you can edit it. And that majordomo config on Linux is found in opt IBM SDP majordomo. And you should create a directory on the file system that this process will have access to for storing runtime data. For example, we just typically use RPT data. We create that, give it permissions. And then in the workbench, where you define a group. Okay, so right now I'm looking at the workbench at a schedule, and this is where you define what agents will be used by this test. And you would add new agents, and that takes you to a dialog where you get to specify the name of the host, and you get to say where the deployment directory is, where the agent is going to store its data. So you can see I specified RPT data there, and in this particular case it's Linux. And when you create that agent, it goes into a particular folder. Now, I created an agents folder, and that's under my locations directory. So part of the setup process for the agent at the workbench is you get to specify where to save the agent information. So I always create an agents directory. It's not there by default. You'll have to create it if you want to use the same structure. But then you can look at the agents there. And one of the things that you see there is the RPT VM args. Now that's not there by default. You would have to say add, and that takes you to a dialog that looks like this, and you give it the property name RPT VM args. And if you're running 64-bit agents, what we found works is running with MX of 4096M and XMN of 1024M. So that's for using 64-bit agents. You can use more memory that way. And the other values are for thread counts. You really don't typically have to specify those at all. But it does allow RPT agents to run with more threads. So if you think you're having problems with threading, you can add that, but I wouldn't bother otherwise. Now another thing that the Workbench can show you is the agent status. There's a little icon up on top which you hover over. It says agent status. When you click on that, it brings up a dialog. It looks like this. It shows you all the agents that are ready to talk to this Workbench. And if you select one of those agents, you can then say share agent with new Workbench, at which point you get to specify the port and name of the new Workbench. And that will go edit the file that's on the agent, so you don't have to do that manually. Once again, be aware you should not do two runs from two different Workbenches that use the same agent. That will screw things up. I mentioned that running a different number of agents could impact the reported response times. It's a good idea to monitor the CPU utilization of at least one agent during a run. RPT allows monitoring CPU and other system resources, so you can just add an agent to that list. There's no hard and fast rule of thumb when the agents are being overworked, but if CPU utilization at the agent gets over 50%, you should consider getting additional agents, or at least do an experiment to see how CPU usage is impacting reported response time. Question comes up sometimes, how can I be sure the workload is spread over all of the agents equally? And the answer is to use all of the agents in each of the scheduled groups. RPT will then spread the V users equally to each agent. RPT does allow statistics to be reported by agent, and you can take advantage of this if you need to know how one group performs compared to another group. Run a different group on each agent and set up RPT to report statistics by agent, and that way you can examine how different groups do. So to summarize, the Workbench talks to the agents and controls them. The agents inject load and execute the scripts. Setting up the agent is an installation manager install. You can specify the VM args to use more memory on the agents, and you can monitor and share the agents from the Workbench. And best practice says if you're doing two different runs to compare, you should use the same number of agents in both runs, preferably even the same agents.